Sitting here with Andrew Cohen. You just arrived from Germany in Holland and brought in the good weather.
Well, it looks like it. Looks like it.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Anytime.
My first question is the big question for everyone here in Holland who is on a spiritual search. What is enlightenment?
So you want to start the interview with such a small question?
Yeah. And then go into the deep with you.
Well, in my particular orientation, which is the orientation I call Evolutionary Enlightenment, I make a distinction between what I call traditional enlightenment and evolutionary enlightenment. So in the traditional definition of enlightenment happens when there is a very deep experience of awakening, recognition, or realization, or discovery of the deepest part of the self and the deepest part of reality itself, which is traditionally called the ground of being. The Buddha called awakening to this depth dimension. He called it the unborn and the deathless. And this is the direct recognition and realization at the level of consciousness, the direct awakening to the foundation, the ultimate foundation of all of reality, which is nothing less than the timeless, formless, void, or empty place, or 0 point, from which the entire creative process burst forth 14 billion years ago. So before the universe was created, before time and space, there was no thing whatsoever. There was no time, there was no space, there was no form, there was no mind, there was no thing at all. So when we enter into very, very deep meditative states, when the mind begins to fall away from the center of our awareness and begins to disappear into the distance, and when our awareness of the world begins to disappear into the distance, and when our awareness of our own physical form begins to disappear into the distance, we become aware of a timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless nothingness, voidness, emptiness, the place of unconditional freedom. The reason it's a place of unconditional freedom is because before the universe was created, before the time process began, nothing ever happened. So before the universe was created, before time began, before history, everything was perfect. So before the universe was created, everything was perfect. In the deepest meditative states, we awaken to this depth dimension that is simultaneous, that is simultaneous with and identical to that timeless, formless, empty 0 point from which everything emerged 14 billion years ago. And the reason that it's such a source of exhilarating freedom and liberation is because when you directly awaken to and directly have the experience, the conscious experience and recognition that the deepest part of reality itself is none other than the deepest part of the self, the deepest part of the deepest part of the self, and the nature of that depth dimension is a timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless freedom that's untouched by anything that ever happened in time. There's a place that's free from pain, free from suffering, free from fear, free from doubt, free from everything. It's the ultimate relief from the burden of existence, from the burden of conscious existence. And so generally speaking, in the traditional Eastern Enlightenment, it's awakening to this absolute depth dimension, or what's traditionally called Brahman consciousness, or Brahman awareness. That's the source of the experience of freedom that great historical luminaries like the Buddha were speaking about. So,
you look a little tired and bored when I asked that question. Is that true, or is it just my perception?
This is your perception.
Okay. You still like to talk about this subject, or because for me it's like I cannot stop listening to people like you who tell me this.
Well, I hope am I boring you?
No, not at all.
Okay.
But I'm guessing that all those seekers like me still ask the same question.
That's okay. That's what I'm here to answer the same questions.
Yeah.
I've been answering the same questions for 30 years.
So, and that never bores you.
Mm-mm.
And the answer is that always the same, or is that just...
Well, it depends upon the context in which I'm asking the questions.
Yeah.
It depends upon the context in which the questions are being asked.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends upon the level of sincerity from which the question is coming from. Of course, that will have some effect. But the subject itself is infinitely compelling and infinitely fascinating.
Any explanation for that? Why is it such a fascinating subject to talk about?
Because we're talking about a dimension of reality that is infinite. So when we talk about that which has no beginning and that which has no end, that which is literally infinite, that which is always a source of absolute and unconditional liberation and freedom, it's always completely intoxicating and mesmerizing and thrilling to talk about it, because as we talk about it, the thing itself comes alive in consciousness, and that's part of the reason why it's so much fun and ever compelling to speak about it. And also remember that traditionally this depth dimension in Vedanta is referred to as Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss, and it's referred to as being ever new, being, consciousness, bliss, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless. Being, consciousness, bliss is ever new, so it's always new, so it's always like the first time.
Always fresh.
Always fresh.
So it's not like I'm reading the newspaper of last week. When I listen to this talk in a year, it still sounds like you were telling me right now.
But the reason is because we're talking about a dimension of reality that's free from time. So if we're talking about a depth dimension that's literally free from time, or is literally timeless, it can never get old. We can never always already know it. We can never already know it. It can never become historical phenomenon. It's only something that can be realized and recognized and understood and seen and felt in the present moment.
And that's why it's not boring.
That's why it's never boring. That's why it's ever new. And it's the only thing that has this quality of ever newness to it. Everything else we can get familiar with and already know. With this particular dimension of reality, this particular depth dimension is something we can never already know.
Yeah. So that's why tomorrow you're going to talk about this from, let's say, 10 in the morning till late in the evening, and that doesn't tire you, or?
No, to me it's a source of infinite energy. It's infinitely compelling and infinitely inspiring. So I believe that God put me on earth to speak about this. That's why I'm here. So if I can't speak about it, or I'm not able to speak about it, I suffer much more than if I have to speak about it.
Yeah. So this fills you with joy, talking about
Absolutely.
this. Yeah.
It fills me with joy, but even more importantly, me speaking about it seems to fill other people with joy also. Yeah. So that's a big part of the reason that I do it. Because when I'm speaking, and this has been happening ever since I met my guru in 1986, he bestowed upon me a gift. And the gift was not actually just to share information, but was the miraculous capacity to be able to directly transmit, share at a level that's deeper than intellectual understanding, the very nature of the miracle of that which is infinite. So in other words, when people are listening to me, they don't just hear the words, but they have the experience of feeling and knowing that which is infinite in a way that they don't ordinarily have access to. And that's the reason that I'm doing it, is to transmit not only a perspective but also an experience.
Yeah. And could that be addictive, that experience?
It is addictive.
Yeah. It could be that I'm going to listen to this talk for the next couple of weeks every time I go to bed, just because the feel of it, or the sphere, the atmosphere it has.
Well, the thing is, the depth dimension we're speaking about is always seeking for itself in time. The depth dimension we're speaking about is always seeking for itself in time. So the spiritual impulse, the impulse that compels us to start seeking for spiritual freedom and for liberation and for enlightenment, is this depth dimension is seeking for itself in and through sentient beings who have not yet awoken to it. It's constantly seeking for itself and trying to awaken to itself and trying to discover itself in the minds and souls of individuals who haven't discovered it yet. Spirit is always seeking for itself in and through form. Spirit is unmanifest, timeless, formless, unmanifest spirit is always seeking for itself in and through form. These bodies and these minds are form, are spirit in action.
And is there a why to it?
Is there a why?
To why would spirit search for itself?
Well, yes, I believe that there is. I believe that there is. And it's my understanding that the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, I call the evolutionary impulse. So there's an evolutionary motive or creative motivation in the universe. And that evolutionary motive or creative impulse emerged from this timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless void. So from nothing came something. So from nothing came, we could say, the desire to exist, the will to exist. So we could see the creative process that gave rise to the evolving universe, and that's giving rise to the evolving universe. We could interpret as the will. There's a will to exist in the creative process. And so I believe that the ultimate nature of spirit, the condition of which before the universe was created was timeless and formless and empty, wanted, this is an anthropomorphic interpretation of ultimate or absolute reality, wanted to exist as form. So I see the beginning of the universe, or the creative leap from nothing to something, from being to becoming, from formlessness to form, as the will of absolute spirit, or God, to realize himself or herself in and through the world of form, which is the creative process itself. So the creative process is formless spirit manifesting itself in and through time and space and form and matter and ultimately life and mind. And there is the evolutionary impulse, or the creative energy that's driving this process, is the experience of an ecstatic compulsion. Life itself is ecstatically compelled to exist, and in that desire to exist is compelled to complexify and become more of what it can be. And human beings experience that, the truth of that, when they feel creatively inspired. Creative inspiration, the desire to give rise to something new that's never existed, inspired by the evolutionary impulse or the creative impulse itself, is the experience of ecstasy and joy. And there's a great sense of urgency, like this really should happen, it needs to happen, it must happen. But the feeling that it must happen, needs to happen, is the experience of a pure positivity. The will to exist, the life impulse in and of itself, the will towards life, in and of itself, if we pay attention to it, is the experience of a purely positive desire to exist. And existentially, that truth means a lot about what it means to be human.
Is that when I tell people who are a little depressed, go out and create, make a great painting,
yes,
write a book?
Absolutely, because that means get out of your neurotic mind and ride the waves and the energy and the intelligence of the creative impulse itself. And I've noticed that when human beings are giving rise to their gifts, whatever their unique creative gifts are, people have different talents. But when people's when their own unique capacity for creativity is moving through them, and they enter into a flow state, and they can feel that something is happening through them, and through this flow state, something is actually coming into being that's beautiful. Individuals experience a state of freedom, and a state of ecstasy, and a state of joy, and a state of wonder that something bigger than them is working through them to give rise to something that potentially has never existed before. And this is a very important expression and manifestation of spiritual freedom.
And you forget about time when you're doing that.
You completely forget about time. You get lost in the creative process, ecstatically lost, because one is in a state of utter one-pointed concentration, and one is compelled by the miracle of the possible. So the most thrilling thing about life itself is always the unmanifest potential, the imminent potential of what could be. So in what I would call the traditional interpretation of an enlightenment or understanding of it is there's an emphasis to be with what is here and now, to be with what is here and now, which is the foundation of the traditional orientation and position. And there's also another orientation, which has to do with more of the evolutionary dimension of enlightened awareness, which is being ever fascinated and ever compelled by the imminence of the possible about what could be. So I always ask people, if you, just to enter into a state of imagination, if you were God, if you were Brahman, if you were the only one that could have created the universe and gave rise to the entire creative process, the entire evolutionary process, and you actually did that, would you be more interested in what you've already created, or would you always be more interested in what you haven't created yet? So most people usually answer, I would always only be more interested in what I had not yet created. So the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe is this creative intensity in consciousness that is always awake to the imminence of the possible, always awake to what could be, and therefore its attention is more on what could be than what is, which is very fascinating. Awake to what could be rather than what is. So it's a unique vantage point, and it's a different vantage point, and both vantage points of the vantage point of the traditional enlightenment, with being present to what is here and now in the present moment, is foundational, and it's essential, and it's very important, and it's the foundation of enlightened awareness. But that's not all there is to it, because there's another dimension to enlightened awareness, and this is why I believe enlightenment itself is evolving. Our understanding of the experience and the appreciation of enlightened awareness, and the human capacities for enlightened awareness is also evolving, because now there's this new emergent, evolutionarily driven fascination with the imminence of the possible. What could be, and there's an ecstatic fascination with what could be, which we all can find access to.
If we're on a pop concert and the band members start jamming,
exactly,
creating something new, the crowd goes wild. Huh?
Yeah.
Same with comedians on stage who we just start joking with the audience. People immediately start applauding. Yes, this is fresh and new. This is what we come for.
So I believe, exactly right. So I believe the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe is that very energy, is that very creative energy and motivation. And when a human being awakens to that same energy and intelligence in themselves, they find a completely new vehicle for spiritual liberation, which is riding the wave of the possible. And when we, as you said yourself before, when we become when we give ourselves, when we become compelled by and give ourselves to the imminence of the possible, we tend to stop thinking about what went wrong and what's troubling us and our neurotic fears and concerns, and we become fascinated by something that's by a purely positive motivation that's ultimate, that relates to the ultimate reason to exist. Because when we, as I was saying a few minutes ago, when we discover that the fundamental motivation that gave rise to the universe, that gave rise to the creative process, and that's giving rise to it right now, is a purely positive, is a purely positive driver. The cosmic will to exist is the experience of pure positivity. It means we begin to experience a much deeper truth about the nature of existence than than ones we tend to be fascinated by when we're lost in our neurotic thinking and the world of our separate self or ego. We tend to be lost in very narrow and small-minded and very self-centered vantage points or orientations in relationship to the experience of being human. So when we break through these deeper dimensions and find a non-relative absolute source of existence and discover that absolute source is a movement and vibration and direct experience of pure positivity, it tells us that the will towards life, the will towards existence itself, is the experience of pure positivity. And when we can experience that directly, we realize that to exist is good, even if we may have had a hard time, as most people have at one time or another, even if we've had a hard time, even if we've suffered. There's a deeper truth, there's a deeper reality, which is that in spite of all of that, the ultimate will to exist, the non-relative or absolute will to exist is purely positive, so that the universe we find is a good place to be. And we also find, from this particular vantage point or perspective, that even being ourselves is a good thing. Even being the unique person and personality that we are, from this perspective, we find it's actually a great gift. It's not a burden to be overcome, which is how too many people feel about themselves and their own lives. It's a great burden to overcome. We suddenly realize that to be ourselves is a great gift. We realize from a non-relative or absolute perspective, I am and you are the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself and realizing and recognizing itself through the body, mind, and personality of, in my case, Andrew, or each and every one of us. This energy, that this body, mind, and personality is a vehicle through which the energy and intelligence that created the universe can recognize itself, realize itself, and consciously create itself. And this is a very liberated. It's a liberated experience, and it's a liberated perspective on the challenge of being human. So then, when there's this shift of perspective and shift of orientation, as I was just been saying, being our unique self, being the human beings that we are with our own unique histories, is no longer a burden to be overcome, but a great gift to be used for the sake of the evolution of the interior of the cosmos. And the interior of the cosmos is subjectivity to consciousness. The exterior of the cosmos is matter and energy. So we realize we have inherent in being alive, and being inherent in being aware of the fact that we're alive, and our human experience has been produced by this cosmic unfolding. We see it as the ultimate opportunity, this great opportunity to consciously participate in creating the universe with the energy and intelligence that gave rise to it in the first place. And that's a very liberating truth.
Yeah, you start smiling when we talk about it. So, what is that force, Andrew, inside me who wants to grab the old and say, "Hey, I did this." Okay, I can tell myself it's the ego who wants to hold on to all my earlier successes. But does this still have a point in evolution, that I can be proud of what I did in the past or what I created, and still show to people?
Well, if we've done good works, if we've done something that's positive, that in its own small but not insignificant way has helped to make the universe a better place, it's appropriate to feel good about it, and to feel a sense of positive pride and a sense of accomplishment. But
want credits for? Is that also a good thing?
Well, it's not. I think it's not good or bad. It has to do with degree. It has to do with how much our ego is identified with the need to be seen as being special. So the compulsive, the conscious and unconscious compulsive desire to see ourselves as being separate, see ourselves as standing out from the others, the world, and the whole universe, is the problem of narcissism. So the need to see ourselves as being separate, standing out from the others, the world, and the whole universe, is the problem. So if we have done something that's very positive, that in its own way makes the world a better place, it's perfectly reasonable and appropriate to feel good about it. But the compulsive narcissistic need to see ourselves as being separate is what the problem is. Because the compulsive narcissistic need to see ourselves as being separate can either be because we may have thought that we did something great, or in other morbid ways we can also want to be recognized because we may feel that we've suffered in ways other people haven't. We want our woundedness and the unique challenges we face to be seen and to be appreciated by other people. We want people to be able to appreciate the uniqueness of our story, and not necessarily for the best reasons, not necessarily for the most positive reasons.
Yeah.
And so, from the perspective of the freedom of enlightened awareness, the source of freedom always comes from a position of letting go of everything, letting go of everything,
Attachment.
But letting go of everything. So, oh, look at all these great things I've done. Can you let go of that? Look at all these. Look at all this suffering I've endured, this pain and suffering and misery. Can you let go of that? Can we let go of that? So, from the perspective of enlightenment and the teaching of enlightenment, the only way to experience the ecstasy of the kind of freedom I've been speaking about in the present moment is always by letting go of everything, and always by letting go of everything, and always by letting go of everything again and again and again and again. Everything positive and everything negative. It's almost like, imagine if you're on a plane. It's like keep on throwing out everything, keep on throwing. So you're always free. You're always starting from the same place, which is a place of emptiness.
A clean slate to.
Yeah, but in order to keep it clean, we have to let go of pride, self-importance, the need to be seen as being special, for whatever reason, and also that includes all of our pain and all of our hurt and all of our grievances and all of our anger and all of our bitterness, and everything else that the ego has a whole story, has a huge agenda built up about its. The ego has a personal narrative based upon our own personal history and the unique nature of our story, and the question is, how invested are we in that story, and how attached to that story are we, and how identified with it are we? So, particularly and uniquely in an enlightenment context, we have to be willing to continue to drop it. Dropping it once isn't enough. Dropping it twice isn't enough. We have to be willing and able to drop it every single day, again and again and again.
But also physical? Should I throw away all my old photos and
no.
And things I got when I did the game?
No. It's not. It's the issue is not what we have materially, or not where we live, or not who we know, who we don't know. It has to do with the places in which we're attached, the places in which we're not free. So the question is, to what degree are we able to let go again and again and again and again? So it's not just an experience of letting go, but it becomes a habit. It's something that we're in the habit of just keeping on dropping the baggage. Pride, arrogant self-importance, fear, anger, resentment.
Do rituals have a place in that, or do you?
Well, we should do whatever we feel is going to help us to let go again and again and again and again. So if a ritual will help to facilitate our ability to keep dropping our baggage and not picking it up again. Because sometimes people are willing to drop baggage for like 5-10 minutes or an hour or so, but then when they leave, they want to pick it up. You say, why? Because they don't want to be without it.
Yeah.
They don't want to be without their story, their unique story about their personal identity, which makes them feel unique and special. And so the challenge of enlightenment is to be, as I've been saying, is to be able and willing to drop that over and over and over again, to be without, to constantly be without it. Because the minute we drop it, it's going to because of habit, because of conditioned habits, that position will constantly start regenerating itself. Even if we have very profound and miraculous, deep experiences of unconditional freedom, this position of the separate self will keep reconstituting itself. So the thing is that these very profound experiences, which have so much potential for liberation, show us a perspective that's not ordinarily available to us, and we need to have enough of those experiences so we know what the position of freedom actually is, or the posture of freedom, the position of freedom, so that we can learn how, so we can know that to keep continually dropping everything and letting go of it and dropping it is the only ideal position to take in relationship to our experience.
We're now in the Netherlands, a big non-duality following over here. People who love to hear the story that I am nobody, there is nothing, there is no world, only the self is real. I'm guessing you have a little different perspective on the Neo-Advaita view, or how do you look at this?
Well, I think there's a very big difference between existence and non-existence, and between being and becoming. So, from the perspective of the deepest part of the self and the deepest part of reality itself, from the perspective of that timeless, formless, empty void that existed before the creative process began, nothing ever happened. So from the vantage point of perspective of the ground of being, nothing ever happened, because history hasn't started yet. But from the perspective of the creative process that had a beginning in time 14 billion years ago, a lot has happened and a lot is happening. 14 billion years ago, something came from nothing, the universe burst into being, and from absolutely nothing whatsoever, energy and matter burst onto the scene. And after about 10 billion years, the cosmos created conditions that made it possible for life to begin to emerge 4 billion years ago. And over this 4 billion years, the capacity of life to complexify and complexify and complexify, creating the conditions that made it possible for mind to emerge about 200,000 years ago. And from mind, the capacity ultimately the capacity emerged for self-reflective awareness, or the capacity to be aware of being aware. So at a certain point, human beings gain the capacity to be aware of being aware. Awareness gained the capacity to be aware of itself. And in that moment, the universe, for the first time, gained the capacity to bear witness to itself through these highly complex life forms called humans. And that's an extraordinary evolutionary leap forward, an extraordinary potential, which when the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe has gained this miraculous capacity to bear witness to itself and to know itself and to consciously create itself. So I would say that when we look at the miracle of evolution in the creative process, a lot seems to be happening, a lot is happening, and it's also giving rise to human beings with unique identities who have the capacity to become conscious co-creators with the energy and intelligence that created the universe in the first place. So remember, there's only one I in the universe, right? There's only one I in the universe. I am, and you are, and we all are, the only one that there could have ever been that ultimately decided to create the universe in the first place. If it's true there's only one I, which as my experience tells me is true, this is what most greatest mystics and realizers have declared, there's only one I. So it's quite something when you realize that one I, that I that's one without a second, chose to create the universe in the first place. So that I chose to take the leap from nothing to something, from being to becoming, from formlessness to form. So in that leap, in that creative evolutionary leap, there was a dynamic leap into being something versus nothing. But that something, of course, is spirit in action. The something that took form is not separate from the nothingness from which it came. It's just changed form. And in that somethingness, there is, as we've been discussing, this dynamic, profound will to exist. And in the will to exist, there's a tremendous force and creative intensity. So taking the position that I don't exist and that nothing ever happened alone is basically denying that the universe exists and has any substantial reality at all, which is, I think one would have to be a fool to say that, because it obviously does. And not because the universe really does exist. Time, space, and form does exist. And it's given rise to the almost infinite creative potential of the creative process, which has made it possible ultimately for the universe to bear witness to itself. This is really happening. It's not an illusion.
They tell me it's a dream.
Huh?
Some teachers tell me it's just a dream.
No, but remember, what those teachers are saying is that from the perspective of the deepest dimension of reality and the deepest dimension of the self, it's never been born and never entered the stream of time. That's true, but that's only one half the picture. So from the perspective of what the Buddha called the deathless or the unborn, yes, nothing ever happened because from the perspective of that deepest part of the self, there's no history. So nothing has happened yet. But that's only half the picture. The other half of the picture is that timeless, formless emptiness jumped through that hole and gave rise to the entire creative process that's in this infinite process of complexification. So something's really happening here. So
Brahman is real, Maya is real.
Yeah, but the point is that the creative process is not Maya, or is not illusory, when you realize where it's come from, because the creative process came from this primordial emptiness and is one with it and not separate from it. The Buddha said the world of form and the world of formlessness are one and not two. Form and formlessness are one and not two. The emptiness and form are one and not two. But there's a third dimension to this picture, which is the world of form and the world of formlessness are one and not two, and the world of form is evolving. The world of form is going somewhere. That's the third and new component to the picture of reality. So that energy and intelligence that's compelling the world of form to evolve is none less than Eros, or the energy and intelligence that created the universe in the first place. Which is to use mythic language, it's the mind of God. So something's definitely happening here. It's not that something extraordinary, profound, and inherently meaningful is happening here. And when we realize that, it liberates us from postmodern tendencies towards nihilism.
That's how you see Neo Advaita, nihilism.
Well, it doesn't have to be, but it can create a worldview or a perspective that can give rise to a nihilistic interpretation of reality. Because if you say nothing's happening, then the next conclusion you can say was nothing means anything. And when we start living in a world that's free from meaning, we start entering into a very dangerous place, where nihilism begins to become the new shared agreement, and that's a very dark place. It's a very dark space, and it's loveless. And
still, it sometimes reassures me, that message, that when I'm in my mind and worrying about a lot of stuff, if someone tells me it's all illusion or it's all mind-made, it's not true. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, when we start to look more closely, when we start to do spiritual practice and we start to meditate, and we begin to scrutinize more closely the nature of the human experience as our own human experience, it pretty quickly becomes obvious to us that most of us tend to spend a lot of time, wasting a lot of time, thinking about things and worrying about things that are ultimately irrelevant, and that just cause suffering to ourselves, and ultimately, if we don't drop them, to other people also. So I think it makes more sense to interpret Maya as the world, the so-called world of Maya occurs to us when our worldview and our relationship to reality is based upon purely relative interpretations to conscious experience. Because when we begin to dig deeper, we begin to find out that there are actually deeper truths that aren't relative, that actually are self-existing, that are an inherent part of reality itself. And when we realize them and recognize themselves and begin to live in alignment with them, it elevates our consciousness and elevates our cognition, because we're literally living in alignment with truths that are not relative, that are absolute. And it's like when that happens, we wake up, we suddenly realize there's an experience of depth and a sense of being connected with life at the deepest level. So then we see and feel a direct relationship between the relative appearance of a separate body and a separate mind and a separate personality, and the infinite depth that we're speaking about here. We feel that we live in the consciousness of that depth, and then our relative body, mind, and personality begins to become animated by that depth, and it begins to reflect that depth. So then that which is relative, our body, minds, and personality begin to become mirrors for this non-relative or absolute dimension of reality, and people begin to feel it and recognize it, that there's something more going on here than is immediately evident. And if it wasn't real, people wouldn't have been speaking about this for thousands of years, that there is an ultimate truth, the knowledge of which changes absolutely everything. And it's as true now as it was 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago.
And will be in the future.
And will be in the future.
Yeah. If I'm correct, your guru was Punjaji.
Yeah, yes, he certainly was.
Yes. But you differ on the subject of behavior in the world, if I recognize it right, that he tells it doesn't matter how you behave in the world, it just plays out, karma. But you think still your behavior in the world has to transform. Is that a right interpretation of what I read?
Yeah, I think what we do and why we do it is very important, and I think working on becoming more and more aware of how conditioned we are as human beings is a very big part of what it means the transformative experience is all about. So that takes work to begin to discover how deeply conditioned we are as human beings. It takes a desire to want to know, to actually want to see the truth and want to know the truth and want to wake up and not be sleepwalking anymore. And that means we have to be willing to take the time and make the effort to pay very close attention to ourselves and to the human experience as ourselves, and that takes inspiration. And we have to be willing to learn how to differentiate in our experience between ignorance and depth and truth, and begin to see all the ways in which we're just sleepwalking, unconscious robots, versus when we're actually awakened sentient beings who are connected with our heart and realize deeper potential. So a big part of having these transformative experiences is also the transformation of behavior and more importantly motivation. When we discover a much deeper motivation to exist, it transforms our reason to exist and our reason to make one choice versus another. And that's a very big part of what this is all about, is the actual transformation, is actual human transformation, and transformation of motivation, intention, and transformation of the motivations and intentions that are driving our actions.
And that sounds like a lifelong journey.
It's an eternal journey.
Eternal journey.
Eternal.
But I'm still, if I'm lucky, I'm 80 years on this planet as this form. So how could it be eternal?
It's eternal because the creative process, as far as we know at this point, is about 14 billion years old. So this moment can only exist in the way that it does now because of 14 billion years of progress that's led up to this moment. So
still when I watch the news, I see people making the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, as is often said, evolution is messy.
Messy.
It's messy, and evolution doesn't move in straight lines. It tends to meander. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It tends to meander, but if you step back far enough from the creative processes, if you step back far enough, you will see that over long periods of time, there's a general developmental line that can be clearly seen if you stand back far enough. So I believe that the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, that took that leap from nothing to something, from being to becoming, from formlessness to form, is from a larger perspective just getting started, because it's apparently taken the universe about 14 billion years to give rise to sentient life forms with complex enough consciousness that can begin to cognize the whole thing. That's only just happened more or less yesterday. The evolution itself was only discovered about 150 years ago. So it's very recent that we've discovered this cosmic, biological, and cultural developmental process that we're all part and parcel of, and that has produced the selves that we are right now. So if it's only when human beings become conscious of evolution that evolution becomes aware of itself, that would seem to be a very important big leap forward in the cosmos. So if that capacity in the cosmos has just emerged after 14 billion years, we could say that this whole process from the perspective of consciousness is just beginning to get interesting.
Yeah.
So we have a long way to go. This process is really at its very early stages. So 14 billion years seems like a long time from an anthropomorphic or human point of view, but from the mind of God, we could say it's not very long at all. We're just getting going.
Yeah. Some more dogmas from the Advaita world, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
The one thing I love to talk about, not so much the last years, but the first time I heard of this was free will. Did I choose to come here and talk to you, Andrew Cohen, or did it just happen? And does it? Do I have anything for it to know the answer to that question? And is there an answer to that question?
There is an answer to that question, is that all human beings have a measure of free will. There's
a measure.
A measure.
And that means a little bit.
A little bit.
Huh.
And the reason we have a little bit is because biologically we're deeply conditioned. Emotionally and psychologically we're deeply conditioned. Mm-hmm. Condition doesn't mean, it's not a pejorative word, it's just a fact. Emotionally and psychologically we're deeply conditioned. So many things that we think or want or don't want or feel, like or dislike, majority of our experience is coming from conditioned reactions that are largely happening on an unconscious level. But we tend to think that we are much more conscious and much more free in our responses than we really are. But the majority of our experience is shockingly conditioned and lacks the kind of freedom that you're speaking about. But in all that, the more conscious we are, the greater is this small measure of freedom to choose. There's a measure of freedom. And usually in relationship to the most important existential questions and choices in our lives, if there's a measure of conscious awareness, these choices are not going to be made from just knee-jerk reactions that come from culture or cultural background or from a psychological background, but will come from having struggled with very important issues. So I think as we evolve and as we become more conscious, this measure of freedom begins to grow. But it's not going to grow by itself. The measure of freedom will grow in relationship to the degree to which we're willing to struggle with the overwhelming complexity of the nature of the condition, with the nature of how deeply and profoundly we're conditioned at so many levels. So if we're willing to struggle with that, work with that, really make the effort to learn how to think objectively and to struggle through confusion, and to deal with our own shadows, and to struggle to see all the ways in which we rarely think for ourselves deeply and profoundly about anything, because we tend to just absorb information and assume it's something we've come to on our own, when very few people actually have that kind of strength or independence. So if we're really willing to struggle with the overwhelming uncertainty and insecurity involved that's involved with making the effort to truly find ourselves, this small measure of freedom or a radical independence to the level of consciousness and cognition will grow. It'll grow and it will deepen. It's like learning how to. It's like growing a new muscle. The muscle has to do, which is where we're really developing a measure of autonomy or radical independence at a very deep level of consciousness and cognition. And it requires hard work and willing to struggle with insecurity. And we have to be willing to question everything in a way that is very hard. But if we have that kind of courage, and we have to be willing to stick with it forever, then this measure of freedom to choose will grow, and we'll become more genuinely and authentically independent and autonomous in our very being. So you know as well as I do that there's some people you meet, they stand out and they strike you when they speak and when they express their ideas and their thoughts and their perspective. You realize they're speaking from a place of depth and a sense of strength and autonomy that comes from having really dug very deep and struggled with a lot of difficult issues in order to come to a place of strength and clarity and a measure of objectivity. But that's tends to be rather rare, because most people are so lost in their conditioned experience that they haven't become truly deeply autonomous or independent entities yet.
So you can train your free will muscle.
Absolutely. But we can train it realizing that it's usually very small.
Yeah.
But you see, if there was no measure of free will, there'd be no way out.
No way out.
There'd be no way out. There would be no freedom. There would be no potential for freedom. There'd be no potential for liberation. There'd be no potential for transformation. There'd be no hope for us.
So all those books who tell me everything happens according to the cosmic plan, that can become an idea.
Well, the cosmic, but there is no cosmic plan.
Ah.
There's no cosmic plan. If we stand back, we look. There are tendencies. There's what's called the great evolutionary biologist called Rupert Sheldrake came up with this phrase called cosmic habits.
Mm-hmm.
So there are cosmic habits or tendencies in the universe, at the levels of energy and matter, biology and mind. These cosmic habits, and which are tendencies to go in a particular direction, all a result of the accumulated momentum of what's already happened. So these cosmic habits create a tendency to go in a particular direction, but no outcomes are predetermined. There's no predetermined outcome.
No.
Because there is no cosmic being that's standing outside the creative process that has already written the script.
But still, sometimes you can think like, okay, so there's only consciousness, and consciousness is doing all those things.
But that's when you see, the thing is, if you say consciousness, I'm with you. When you say consciousness is doing anything, then we have to say, well, what does that mean? So, for example, when in my philosophy, when I say if consciousness is doing something, I relate it to this evolutionary driver in the universe, which everybody realizes exists.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's that there's a momentum towards greater complexification in the cosmos that's obvious. If we look, we see it's there. So then we can say you can relate the fact that consciousness seems to be going in a particular direction. And then if you begin to look closely, we could begin to see the reasons why. And it's usually always related to what happened before that, and before that, and before that, and before that, which creates a certain tendency.
Evolving.
Yeah, and then definitely. But then when consciousness becomes aware of itself, and when mind becomes aware of itself through the awakening to consciousness itself, and the capacity to make choices enters into the picture, then that's when human consciousness realizes its own divinity, because you realize the creative potential, the leading edge of the creative potential in this cosmic unfolding is in our hands. It doesn't exist outside our hands. And then the whole issue of freedom and choice, and what's made it motivating us to make the choices that we are, suddenly becomes all important in a way that we've never even imagined before. Because then the capacity to make choices realizes the choices we're making are going to define the destiny and the future of the interior of the whole universe. So then to have the capacity to make choices, to have the capacity to make conscious choices, suddenly becomes overwhelming. The implications of what it means to have the capacity to make choice. It's no longer a huge burden, but the significance of being able to make conscious choices becomes the ultimate expression, the ultimate potential expression of that which is sacred in the universe and in the world itself, and the relationship between the awakening to the greater and greater capacity to make free choices and the will of God the relationship between those two begins to unfold like a flower opening right before us, and then suddenly being ourselves, being a human being who realizes all this in the world, it suddenly becomes enormous. And this transcends the small ego, the small self sense in the most extraordinary way. It blows it out of the water, and suddenly we feel an enormous sense of responsibility and an obligation in being here and being human and knowing all these things and knowing this and feeling a great sense of responsibility for what's possible.
So it's not like the Dutch philosopher Spinoza once said, God throws a stone and the stone says, I'm flying. It's that phrase that stuck with me, and you can replace the word God with consciousness and then think consciousness is just moving everything. And there's
but of course part of what's unfolding is arbitrary.
Yeah.
Part of what's unfolding is arbitrary, and part of what's unfolding very much has to do with the combination of these cosmic habits, which are tendencies to go in a certain direction, and then gradually more and more informed choices that come from minds and souls that have been more awakened, and more awakened in the sense means more conscious of context and more conscious of the complexity involved in the whole process, and the aspiration to take responsibility for as much of it as possible.
So let's take the example of the driver's seat. Am I sitting at the wheel with God next to me? We both have the wheel in our hands, or is he giving directions?
Your website's all about non-duality.
Yeah.
So what we're calling God here is not separate from you. Remember, I said before, there's only one I in the cosmos. I am, and you are the only one that there could ever be.
Yeah.
There's only one. So that one that existed for eternity before the universe was created chose at a certain point to give rise to the creative process. And so when you feel the I sense, and I feel that I sense, we're both feeling that I sense in which there is only one I, there's not two. And that I is not merely your personal ego, your personal identity and your personal soul, but is at a much deeper level, non-separate from the energy and intelligence that chose to create the universe 14 billion years ago. And so the more you realize that, the more you awaken to that truth, the more you start to feel in awe of what it means to be a human being who begins to awaken to who he or she really is. I am, and you are, the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself through the body, mind, and personality of Andrew or each and every one of us. That's who you really are. So this cosmic self awakens to itself through this form, and then this form is seen not as the end, but as a vehicle through which the creative process can take responsibility for its own direction, and that completely displaces the small-minded, self-centered ego's orientation to what it means to live my life for me and a slave to the fears and desires of the small self. We discover a cosmic identity. Our cosmic identity has cosmic motives. The cosmic motives are realized through this small vehicle, and that's when what it means to be alive opens up to the infinite.
Yeah. So I have been talking to I for about an hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, there is only, but the thing is, if the ultimate realization of enlightened awareness is the recognition of that there's only one, not two. There's only one and not two.
Advaita. Yeah.
There's only one and not two. But that means that what the feeling of I is that one without a second. If we don't look too closely, we assume it's our ego. But it really, if you look more really deeply, you say, no, that's not really my ego. That's the one self.
Pretending?
No, it's the one self that existed before the universe was created. It's the one self that chose to create the universe, and it's the only self that there could ever be. So what I always like to ask people, if you believe that there's only one and not two, and you realize that you are the only one that there ever could have been, that there is, that means you're the only one that could have made the choice to create the entire universe. Which is, if that's true, that means where we're going and how we're going to get there is your responsibility. Who else's responsibility could it be? So of course that's completely overwhelming, but that's ultimately the truth that in an evolutionary orientation to enlightenment or to spiritual liberation we want to begin to grapple with, because the implications are overwhelming. Yeah. For all the best reasons, for all the right reasons, because it forces us to question the small-minded identity of the separate self, which has a totally personal agenda in relationship to the gift of being human. And so when you have this kind of realization that the agenda of the small self is displaced, literally displaced, and this cosmic self-sense begins to emerge in our soul, in our heart, in our mind, it begins to vibrate, it reveals itself, and we become a completely different person, a person who's awake to who he or she truly is. I am the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself through the body, mind, personality of my unique, separate self. And the personal narrative gets displaced in the most profound way. And so that's too much for a lot of people because it's just too big. It's just too radical. It's too outrageous. It's too unthinkably outrageous. Could it really be true? Me, little old me? You say, yeah. That's who you really are, if you have the courage to face it. Do you have the courage yet? Or do you need a few more lifetimes to live through this nightmare of a personal separate existence. You want to suffer through this for more before you have the courage to embrace the unthinkable implications of who you really are. And the answer is most people aren't ready for it. It's just too much. It's too overwhelming.
Too much of what? Freedom?
I think the enormity of the implications of the truth of what that means right now, most people can't handle it. It's just because they say, well, if that's true, then that means so much of what I've thought about who I am and who everyone else is. These are just partial truths. They're not absolute truths. So it's frightening or it's thrilling and frightening at the same time.
Can it be handled?
Huh?
Can it be handled?
Absolutely. We have to be ready. We have to because as when the genuine enlightenment is real, we have to be at that point in our own evolution as an individual when we're ready to let go.
Let go of
everything.
Personal story, belongings, family.
Well, it's we have to be willing to let go of everything. It doesn't mean we have to walk out on our family or anything, but we have to be willing to let go of an unenlightened relationship to what it means to be human. So it means all the places that we're attached and unfree we have to be willing to let go of all of it. We have to be willing to let go of all of it. We have to be willing to let go of all of it, as we said at the beginning, over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like continually lightening our load. So
dropping the baggage.
So that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with walking out on anybody, but it has to do with a liberated relationship to what is. A liberated relationship to what is. A liberated relationship to being in a relationship. A liberated relationship to being a mother and a father and a sister and a brother. To being a businessman or a postman or a musician or an artist or a scientist. A liberated relationship to being human and on every level as much as possible. Based upon the actual awakening to knowing who we really are, who I am and you are, the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself through the body, mind, personality of myself and yourself. That's the truth. And then from that cosmic perspective, we embrace all these other lesser dimensions of ourselves held in this huge embrace, this huge cosmic embrace. And then we're not living a small life anymore. We're living a big life for very big reasons, because we have no choice anymore. Because the energy and intelligence that created the universe is depending on us. Because if we're not going to do it, who else is going to do it?
True. So that's what you are also telling the people who are coming to visit you?
Yeah, over and over again.
Do you do any practices with them? Do you
Sure.
meditate?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. But this seems like a very individual approach to everyone, because not everyone is at the same stage or with the same troubles or the same attachments. How does that work in a group like this?
Well, most people find this message very inspiring.
Yeah, it is, of course.
But
the work?
Sorry?
The work you have to do yourself, or can you help with that? Or
Yeah. But I mean, the point is that most people find it very inspiring, and because what I'm sharing with people, amongst a lot of things, is a new narrative. It's a new story. It's a new grand narrative, a new big perspective. So that's not only inspiring for the unique individual, but it becomes inspiring on a collective level. Because when you begin to embrace a teaching and a perspective like this, and in the context of other people who are sharing and embracing a huge perspective like this, when the perspective is shared, it gets bigger. It starts growing, and then you realize that even that sharing this unique perspective in consciousness with others, the thing itself starts to deepen and grow and become more powerful, and then that is its own form of ecstasy. That's its own form of liberation, and that's its own unique thrill. Because then you get pulled out of the small, and it's yet another way to get pulled out of the small world of the separate self. And then so when you share with other people, you're sharing kind of it's a utopian. It's a utopian ideal. It's a utopian promise, which most people would be reluctant to embrace this kind of big thinking, because it's unheard of. I mean, it's thought of being. But when you give yourself the freedom to do it, there's a feeling of lifting off, like you're in a balloon that's lifted, like you're leaving the earth behind, and because you leave the earth behind, you start seeing everything from a completely different vantage point. Most people are lost in the story down there. They say, "Wake up! Can't you see?" And they're in it. They're lost in the crowd. they're lost in a place where everything is so pedestrian. The perspective is so pedestrian. But when you take off in this balloon and you do so with other people, you start seeing, oh, look around. You see everything in so much context. And in a context of so much infinite potential, it changes everything. And when you share that pure excitement of the possible with other people, it's the greatest form of exhilaration.
And you don't need any drugs for that.
Well, this is its own. The awakening to this creative impulse is its own. Becomes a source of pure joy.
Yeah. I have a taste of what you're pointing at. Still, some people call it like a collective hypnosis or something, and they think, "Oh, we all start believing you," but that's not. I'm sharing a perspective, and I'm sharing a truth. I'm not asking anybody to believe everything. I'm asking them to consider what I say and look into it. But what I'm saying is, I'm teaching a very rational form of spiritual enlightenment. I'm not asking anybody to take my word for anything. Just consider what I'm saying on its own terms and see what happens. And if you do that honestly, your consciousness will begin to expand as a result, and you'll find that there's a reason why. And it's beyond the words. You could maybe sit here for half an hour and transmit this also, or?
Yeah, we could sit quietly, but I don't think that would work very well in an interview.
No, that's true. But you do that with the people who come and visit you here.
Well, yeah, I can and I do, and I like to do that.
Yeah.
And especially, I prefer to sit in silence with people if I have a lot of time with them.
But still, the thing I most enjoyed about this talk was, besides the information, was you like a little childish smile on your face, which tells me this, what you're talking about, this wonder in your eyes, or this expression.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean every word.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any practical information we have to add to this? Is there some new stuff coming out of you?
Well, I'm working on a book, but it won't be ready for about another year. And I'm traveling and teaching about 9 months of the year at this point.
Yeah.
And stay tuned. A lot more coming.
AndrewCohen.com or org. No, .com.
AndrewCohen.com.
AndrewCohen.com. We'll put it underneath this interview. Thanks for this great talk.
Thank you. You did a great job. I admire your courage at being utterly spontaneous.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of courage. It's beautiful.
It's the thing I love to talk most about. It still fascinates me. But
do you feel a little bit of what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do you feel the liberating potential?
Yeah. Yeah, we could go on for another hour, but there's some people waiting, and there's
next time.
Yeah, there's one of the 2 days that has nice weather in Holland, so we have to go outside. Thanks.
Thank you.